Hello everybody, it's your pal E.V.A here, and you might have already heard of this, but recently there's this art challenge where you take this color wheel and draw a character on each one. I love making monochromatic artworks and have done plenty myself. Most people draw fan art for these color wheels, and even though I would normally draw my own characters, I decided it would be fun to also draw some fan art. I chose these myself and decided to go with things from shows and stuff I enjoy. So let's begin with Red. There were a lot of characters I could have chosen for Red, but I decided to go with Wei Wuxian from Madu Sushi, mostly because I hadn't gotten the chance to draw him fully yet. If you don't know what that is, it's made by the same author who made Heaven's Official Blessing, and it follows the story of the demonic cultivator Wei Wuxian, who after being killed got brought back to life in the body of another man who had summoned him. He gets brought in by the people of the Lan clan, I think that's what they're called, where his love interest Lan Wonji is. It's a really good story, and it has the donghua, live action, manhwa, audio drama, and I think eventually game adaptation of it. There's a lot. Fair warning, it does get a bit raunchy in certain areas, so just keep that in mind, and a little cursed in some areas too. So just keep all of that in mind, and if you have read the story, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Something that I wanted to do for this challenge was draw each character in some of my different styles, so I felt like it would match this show and character. So for this one, I decided to go with my painterly style, where I outline with my sketch brush and overall avoid using the G pen or other hard brushes. I decided to draw him with his flute with some swirls around him. Something else I tried doing but ended up changing later was using the colors of the two wheels next to him as the light sources, but I ended up changing it as I tried doing this with other characters, but it didn't work out so well. Something else I did was edit the wheel panels themselves by creating a gradient for them and then creating a design on them that matches the character best for them. So for Wei Wuxian, I decided to make the pattern swirls on the sides that match the swirls around him, and that was the drawing for Red. Now, I went with a bit of an interesting choice for Orange. I decided to go with Lena Inverse from the show Slayers. If you haven't heard of this show, it's a 90s anime taking place in a fantasy world full of strange creatures, kingdoms, thieves, and sorcerers, and among them is the great Lena Inverse, feared by all thieves with a fiery temperament and appetite. Along with her are the swordsman Gauri, who is the definition of a himbo, your good old edgelord Zelgadis, and justice-loving Amelia. It's a very interesting show. It's very shonen-y. Each season has their own arcs. I think some of them even have a couple arcs, but it's also a comedy. It might not say that, but it is, and it's overall a fun experience. It is very 90s, although it does have newer seasons that I think came out later. But yeah, it's a very 90s adventure fantasy show, but seeing as it was one of the first anime shows I watched, I figured it would be a good pick for this color. The only problem being that Lena doesn't have a whole lot of orange, it mainly being in her hair, so I had to adjust some of the colors so that I could have the excuse of drawing her here, as there aren't many other primarily orange characters that I know of and like enough to draw. I decided to draw her casting a fireball. I also forgot to mention that Lena is very destructive. There's this one spell called the Dragon Slave that's basically a huge bomb, and she's casting that spell basically every other episode, but I drew a fireball because, you know, orange. I also decided to go ahead and draw her in my normal style, and it was interesting drawing her in my style. Kind of translating her here kind of made my style a bit more sharper, I think, because of this 90s style of the original show being a very like sharp style. You know, if you've seen some of the screenshots, you'll know what I'm talking about. That was pretty much it for Orange. The next color was Yellow, and I was having some trouble figuring out which character to draw, but I decided to go with Yellow Diamond from Land of the Lustrous, so that way I had an excuse to talk about the show more, but also so I could draw this in my Land of the Lustrous style. I talked about this in my last video, but my Land of the Lustrous style is basically where I rendered the skin and quote-unquote skin and clothes very simply, and the hair and eyes to be super shiny with a diamond jagged brush. Yellow Diamond is an interesting character. Their arc in the manga is very in-depth and goes over the idea of them being the oldest of the gems and the idea of immortality. I had actually debated if I wanted to include them in the lineup of gems that I drew last video, but I decided to just stick with gems that I thought had the biggest impact on Froze's change. I had a bit of a hard time drawing their eyes because of how slanted they are, but other than that, this one was fairly easy. It did take a bit, but that's because the style usually takes more time in the rendering alone. But like I said, I think Yellow is an interesting character. I won't spoil stuff from the manga, but their dilemma involving Zircon because they're afraid of losing them, like they've lost all their other partners, I feel like is well done. And then learning that Zircon's main weakness is how they care for Yellow. It's very interesting. But like I said, it all kind of connects back to the idea of what immortality and always being able to be put back together, and the metaphorical scars never quite healing being represented by all the Lustrous basically, and even some of the others. But back to the drawing, shading the hair and eyes were obviously very satisfying. I thought that the highlights would be a bit more harder to make clear because of their hair color, but it wasn't as bad as I thought. For the wheel, I used the diamond brush to create a particle effect, as well as adding some particles around them. And if you look closely, I may have added hints of green, pink, blue, and red, and you probably knows what those color represents. I was also having trouble figuring out what to draw for green, but I decided who better to draw than Trouble themselves. Introducing Double Trouble, the lizard envy that stole my gender, but that's a story for another day. I absolutely love them. Double Trouble is from the show She-Ra and was introduced in the 4th season. They have the ability to shapeshift and is extremely sly and dramatic. It's just such a theater kid, like definitely. I knew they would be a perfect fit for this slot. I was having trouble figuring out what pose to draw them in, since I was drawing everyone in these combat poses, showing off their power and abilities, but because Double Trouble doesn't have any weapons, I wasn't sure what to do. But I figured just having them be there, being all fancy while also showing their power would be the most Double Trouble thing. So I went with a very dramatic sitting pose. It was really interesting drawing them in my style, but I had a lot of fun with it. Again, I decided to draw this one in my normal style, but it was a bit hard to figure out how much to shade when I knew that half of them would be covered in black to mimic the shape-shifting effect they have in the show. The way I created this effect though was to create a clipping layer to the main folder and airbrush the black on one side, and using the smudge tool to create some swirl effects, very subtly though. I then used a particle add glow brush to create the green little particles. They also have a green blurred rim around them when they shapeshift as well, so I created that as well. And for the wheel, I created some swirly patterns to match their tail and made some more particles using the same brush as before. And yeah, that was pretty much it. Very simple design. They have a very simple design, but I think it works really well, and I surprisingly had a fun time drawing their tail. Very swirly, very, very fun to draw that. And yeah, that was it for my favorite lizard envy. The next color was cyan, and I decided to draw Shiro from the show E.V.A. The main thing I absolutely love about E.V.A. are the colors and like all their color palettes and the colors they use for the background and the shading. It's all just so good. I just want to study their color palette so much. It's really good. But I decided to draw Shiro because he does have some cyan elements, especially, and this is actually spoilers for the show, so if you don't want to be spoiled, I would recommend to go watch it. It's on Netflix, so you can go watch that. But yeah, in his silver wolf form that I drew in the background, which is funny because it's not actually silver, I thought it would match well. The style that I drew this picture in is quite different because it's a style I've been experimenting with for a project of mine, but I basically just tried to make it look more like pop art with screen tones, thicker line art, which I created by using a different brush and slightly brighter colors. For the line art, by the way, I used the brush pin brush, which might be a default brush in Clip Studio. I'm not actually sure, but it's a really good one. And I also used linear light layers instead of multiply and glow dodge layers instead of add glow. Now, I do realize that this one in particular might seem a bit rushed, and I do apologize for that because it was getting very late when I was drawing this, and I was trying to just get it done so I could go to bed. So as you can see, I decided to draw Shiro in his human form, even though I can draw anthropomorphic animals anthropomorphic animals just fine, and characters. I wasn't sure how this wolf form would look in my style. It's very distinctively almost realistic wolf, like more realistic wolf than how I would draw wolf characters, and figured since I was going to draw his silver wolf form in the background, that would be better that way. As you can see, I added these screen tone elements on top of the main shading layer and as the overlay gradient. I also added some screen tones on the color slot and some wisps, and that was it for cyan. The next color was dark blue, and there was going to be no other option other than my main boy Kaya. At first I was going to draw him in his normal design, but then something amazing happened. That's right, he's got a new skin and it looks so good. This was the perfect chance to be able to draw him in it. I actually love how it looks, and I also love, despite it being a very typical Genshin design with a lot of details, it's actually a little easier to draw him in this than in his main look, in my opinion anyway, since it's easier to tell which item of clothing is which, again, all in my opinion. And of course, because it's a Genshin design, it did take me the longest out of any of these, but that's okay because I don't mind spending extra time to draw this beautiful man. Actually, Kaya has been my main DPS since I started the game, and I have been working on the new event to get his new skin, but luckily I have plenty of time in order to do that, and I already have a good number of vouchers, so it's all good. And yeah, obviously the things that took me the longest were the line art and the base colors, but that's nothing I'm not used to when drawing Mihoho characters, and I was trying out a different method of drawing gold and his gems by keeping those layers separate from the base layer, so that way I can easily select those parts individually to add some extra shading. And for the shadows on the gold parts, I actually used a dark yellow rather than a dark blue I was using for everything else. But other than that, I drew this one in my normal style, and I also decided to draw his ice particles from his burst, which I hadn't ever drawn properly before, but I think I got them to where they look good. For the snow effects, I just used the droplet brush, and for the slot, I of course added plenty of stars. And that was all for my favorite man. I really like how this turned out, and I had a lot of fun drawing his new look. For purple, I decided immediately to go for Homura from Puella Magi Madoka Magica. Puella Magi is still one of my favorite anime, highly recommend, and for this drawing, I wasn't sure what pose to draw her arms in. At first, I was going to draw her with her bow and Madoka's hair ribbon, but because I thought that would be too big, like it would stand out too much, I drew another sketch with just her gun. But after looking at it, I decided to just go with my first idea, and I'm glad I did. You don't really see her with her bow until the end of the anime, and only a little bit in the movie, but I really wanted to draw it. And the arrow makes for a good lighting source, so yeah. It was a pretty big contrast drawing her after drawing Kaya, since her design is so much more simple. The composition I put her in was good for me to practice drawing flowing hair, and I also found a bunch of references for her hair, so that was good. Since this drawing is a Madoka character, I went with much heavier on this hatching style, since their line art also consists of some hatching shading. I think that Homura is such an interesting character, and in my opinion, I think the Rebellion movie was very much needed for her arc, since she didn't really get a completion for it in the anime. Speaking of which, we'll hopefully have that new movie they were teasing soon, because I will definitely watch it. With the arrow and bowstring, I put them both in glow dodge and add glow layers, but because they're mostly on white backgrounds, it doesn't the effect doesn't show as much, but that's okay. For the background, I created a gradient wash thing with one of the default hatching brushes in Clip Studio, although it did wash out the purple color quite a bit on the actual slot. Overall, not too much to say about this one, but I like how it turned out. And now for the final color, pink, or kind of more of a fuchsia color pink. I don't know, who's to say. I decided to draw Spider-Gwen from Spider-Verse. Now, you might be thinking that's kind of a stretch because she doesn't have a lot of pink in her design, but you know, she does have some, and she's sometimes represented with that color, and I just wanted an excuse to draw a Spider-Verse character and talk about the new movie, okay? Okay, which I absolutely loved. I had so much fun watching it in theaters, especially because we watched the first one in theaters, and Into the Spider-Verse is my favorite movie ever and one of my biggest inspirations, but I have to say that Across the Spider-Verse probably stands on that same level. I loved how much more attention Gwen got and loved seeing her backstory, or I should say canon event, in more detail. Also, the scenes with her and her dad were amazing. No joke, when I first saw that scene, I was just like, the visuals though, they were so good. I love the watercolor look. I use watercolor like brushes and techniques all the time in my art, and when it comes to traditional art, watercolor is definitely one of my preferred mediums, and it was so cool getting to see how Gwen's world looked, and I love the colors they used for it. Even in the first movie, when we only saw glimpses of it, I loved it, and it's actually one of the inspirations for my story Moonstone. And of course, everything else about the movie was great. Indian Spider-Man and Hobie were just so cool. Getting to see Miles again and his growth, it was amazing. Please go watch it. Please, I'm trying so hard not to ramble about it and spoil it, so go watch it. Speaking of Gwen, there has been a lot of talk that Gwen might possibly be transgender, which if so is really cool, and I really hope that's true, because that's really cool. It makes a lot of sense though when you think about how much blue and pink and white are used, not just in the scene with her and her dad, but even in her design, if you think about it. Speaking of which, even though she doesn't have a whole lot of pink in her design, I was able to make it work by just adding more pink in the rendering. I used a combination of the style I did for Wei Ying and the style for Shiro, keeping it all very painterly but using blend modes like linear burn and glow dodge. And at the very end, I added in some screen tones as a gradient for her and her background, and added some more wispy watercolor effects. And that was it for Gwen and this drawing. This drawing took forever to do, but I really like how it turned out and being able to talk about some of my favorite characters from my favorite things. I hope you all have enjoyed this video, and if you did, make sure to subscribe and like, of course. I have a few other bigger videos coming out, so if you want to see those, feel free to stick around. And if you want to see this drawing, it should be on my Instagram very soon. And don't forget to check out my comics on my webtoon. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye!